Get going here. Last live lesson before Thanksgiving break. So we're again talking about trading globalization. Today we're going to talk about the questionable, thank you, and negative components of that. Okay, so I'm going to take a couple minutes to make sure everybody is either on or watching later is aware of what's going on, right? The same announcement sheet as I normally put out there. Check your Canvas inbox and make sure that you're seeing anything that's missing. Look through your Canvas grade book and see what your grades are looking like. And I think most of y'all are aware of the fact that I'm expecting a bit more than some classes that you've had. And so you don't want to be getting behind on this class because it's not going to be one that trying to rush through making up stuff is going to go super well, right? Um, so this week we're working on investigating contemporary economic policies and analyzing how ideologies influence their implementation, and then evaluating the impact of globalization and trade on the economic well-being of a country. And then we're kind of starting on this one. That one's going to be more the week after Thanksgiving. The essay question this week is going to be about the impact of globalization and trade. And so you really needed to wait until after you watched this live lesson to kind of be able to answer the essay question on that, because I'm about to kind of give you some of the negative side of that so you can really evaluate for yourself. Okay. And I obviously want your work, not someone else's work. All right. So what we're needing this week is obviously the live lessons, right? You need to watch those, okay? Because those I use both my live lessons and the tutorials and the ed puzzles in making a quiz. Okay, so I look at all that stuff and I'm making sure that I'm fairly assessing all the material that I've used. Okay, so this week most of it is on a progress learning quiz, and then there's the one essay question. The next 2 weeks after Thanksgiving, we're going to go back to there's going to be more essays because the standards kind of are directed that way again. So yeah, you got a couple of ed puzzles. Remember, the ed puzzles can be redone until you make 100 on them. So why not, right? And then the ed minims. I think most people are getting the hang of this, but I actually, even though it's a real pain in the butt, go through and look at every slide. Right. And so, I'm wanting you to do the work. So I look at every slide because how am I going to expect you to do the work if I'm not going to actually look at it? Right. And so you need to make sure you put in good work on all the slides. You can't do the admin tutorials well in 15 minutes. Okay. I look at them, but I'm just telling you right now, if you're doing it in 10 or 15 minutes, you're not doing all the work. Okay. You're just not. All right. Most people who are doing good work are taking like an hour or more on those things. All right. Um, okay. Now, today's goals are understanding why there's not always free trade between nations all the time, and then describing some different trade organizations in the world, the benefits of those trade organizations, the negatives of them, and then analyzing the effects of their policies. And I'll tell you, this stuff on trade and globalization, there's a lot of disagreement. And sometimes it's not even based on one party or the other. It's not super clear as to who's on which side on that. And that has kind of been shifting over the last 10 or 15 years as to what used to be the case. Right. So I'm going to talk about a few organizations, and then within that, I'm going to talk about some of the negative effects. Okay. You do not have to talk. Okay. All right. So the first one is going to be NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. All right. It was formed in 1994, and it was established free trade basically between the three nations, meaning no tariffs, quotas, or embargoes, which I think I went through those last time. Okay. And it increased the amount of trade between those three countries and pretty much made them our largest trade partners, which you should have seen in the Adminum tutorial this week. Okay. So NAFTA was recently updated and it's now called the US, Mexico, Canada, right? Is basically what the agreement's called now. Similar idea, very similar purposes and policies. Okay. So what does it do? It grants what's called the most favored nation status to all three nations, meaning that we give them each other better trade agreements than we do anybody else. eliminates tariffs on imports and exports between the three of us, free trade. All right, we have to recognize and respect the trademarks and copyrights of each of the nations. That's one of the ones, like, for example, with China, that we get really mad at them because they don't respect our copyright agreements, right? And so they'll just, steal and plagiarize our stuff all the time. And then according to, NAFTA exporters have to get, they have to go through a certain process to prove that there's no tariff, right? And then we have procedures to resolve trade disputes between us. Okay. Now, some pros of this, and I just kind of got some outlines of this, and then I'm going to kind of give you more thoughts on the pros and cons. So, the free trade increases sales for the US, Canada, and Mexico, strengthening their economies. I think if you actually did the Edmonton tutorial correctly, they got you to kind of dive into some of those numbers. Okay. That's kind of how this is supposed to be designed. So the lack of tariffs means that you can sell your goods in other countries at lower prices, as opposed to if they had protectionism with the tariffs up, and makes them more expensive in those countries and harder to buy. But we don't have tariffs there, so Mexico can sell their stuff here without a tariff, and we can sell our stuff there without a tariff. Okay, creates jobs in Mexico, reduces inflation by decreasing the cost of imports. Okay, so it kind of keeps prices lower. Makes it easier for Americans to buy stuff from Canada and Mexico and vice versa. And real wages means, relatively speaking, and we'll get to inflation week after Thanksgiving, real wages relative, like purchasing power of people in the three countries, has gone up. Okay, so we're, better off and can buy more stuff than we could before NAFTA started. All right. And this one's where it gets controversial. American and Canadian companies can take advantage of lower Mexican labor costs while keeping their corporate entities in the home country. Meaning, Ford is still located in Michigan, but they have certain assembly things in Mexico, right? That's kind of the idea. Okay. Now, NAFTA, this is 2017, and I would say it's still true with even with the revised one. All right. This is just the more recent kind of infographic I could find. Views of that depend on party. Okay. So in Mexico, the two different parties, mostly have a positive view of NAFTA's results. In Canada, very positive. Okay. Overall. In the United States, though, the Democratic Party seems to fit within where Mexico and Canada are feeling like it, but the Republican Party is very anti that. This is 2017. The reason for that is the Trump part of the movement in the Republican Party has become very against some purposes of free trade, things with free trade, because they say it hurts American jobs. Right? I'm gonna get into that in a minute, but notice that, look, there's at least 30% of Democrats that didn't like it, what was going on with it, and 70% of Republicans. Now, that's not saying whether or not they were right to feel that way or not. That's just saying they were feeling that way. Okay. And that depends on where they're getting their news, what news we're getting, how we're feeling about it, whether we know what's true, false, etc. about it. Okay. All right. So let's talk about some of the negatives and then why some Americans might be kind of, feeling that way about it. So NAFTA has negative impacts on farmers in Mexico who saw their food prices fall based on cheap imports from U.S. agribusiness. So agribusiness, here's the idea. I don't know if any of y'all ever traveled to the Midwest, but you got these gigantic farms, right? With fancy technology. And so with very few workers and advanced technology, they can produce lots and lots of stuff. So Mexican farmers that were doing more smaller operations were knocked out of business on a lot of things, right? Like, say, corn. Okay. Now, that doesn't knock them out of business on, say, sugar or coffee or avocados, because you can't grow those things as well in the United States as you can there, except for, say, avocados in California. But what you see is that a lot of the smaller farmers are knocked out of business because they can get cheaper products from the U.S. Okay. So we actually we can produce things cheaply in terms of food products in the United States in a lot of cases. On the U.S. side, the negative of NAFTA has been, I think, a really clear one. Okay, really, really clear. Free trade has hurt manufacturing jobs in the U.S. There's no doubt about this. Okay. Um, Manufacturing, assembly industries who lost jobs. So if you look back before NAFTA, there was about 18 million U.S. manufacturing jobs. Okay, so NAFTA comes about here. They start moving a lot of the businesses, say down to Mexico or whatever, and it really drops off. Now, that's not just about Mexico. That all also has to do with the rise of manufacturing in, China and Vietnam and things like that. So the point being, though, free trade or almost free trade has made U.S. manufacturing go down a lot. Okay. Now, so that's where you're going to see, for example, when you look at this, why has Ohio become a Republican state? Well, because Republicans have been pointing out this negative right here. Okay. And Ohio lost a lot of manufacturing jobs. Okay. That's what's going on. That's where the kind of the blue collar jobs in the Midwest and a lot of those states, if you're like, well, what's the deal with the trend in certain politic kind of things? That's where that trend is coming from. Okay. That's where, Pennsylvania went Republican in 2016 for the first time in a long time. That's where Michigan and Wisconsin went Republican in 2016 for the first time in a long time, is partially on the back of this argument right here. Okay. Is it switched off enough of the blue collar workers, meaning, people who work in these sorts of, manufacturing jobs, industrial jobs. Right. And so, that's kind of the deal with what we're looking at here in terms of some people with their negative, the negative viewpoints of NAFTA. All right. So again, there's a positive, but I want to present fairly to you the negative part. And this is one where, man, I can go back and forth on this. Like, I see the positives, I see the negatives, and it's a tough thing to deal with. Like, what's better, what's worse? It's hard to say sometimes. Okay. Critics also argue that NAFTA has contributed to rising levels of inequality in both the US and Mexico. So, point being that, okay, you got more people who are, the people who are at the top of the job chains, right, who are making more and more money, um, in the top like level business executives, but the gap between the rich and the poor is actually getting bigger. All right, so that's an argument that NAFTA has been negative. Two, some economists believe that NAFTA hasn't been enough or worked fast enough to produce kind of more equality between, say, Mexico and the U.S. and Canada, and it hasn't done enough to reduce poverty. All right, and I think there's some strong arguments on that. Again, both ways. Right now, I just want to make sure that I'm clear on outsourcing here. Okay. So a major issue with NAFTA and other free trade agreements is outsourcing. So the idea of outsourcing, here's the definition, is to obtain goods or services from an outside or foreign supplier, especially in place of an internal source. Okay. So in short, the idea is that companies can get their product made cheaper in another country and then ship them back to the US. So basically, an automaking job that was in Detroit, Michigan for Ford can now be in Mexico, and they can get the stuff shipped back here, made by Mexican workers who are getting paid less than people in Michigan were. Okay. Same with, say, shoes. Why do we get you check your shoes are probably made in Vietnam? Why? Because the people in Vietnam are getting paid a lot less than people are in the United States. Right. And so Nike can get their shoes made in Vietnam and shipped back to the United States for cheaper than they can make them here. Okay. Now, what does that mean for us? It does mean that our prices are lower, man. Like, that's true. Okay, that is true. But what's the cost of this? Okay. So I think there's a different cost when we look at like the margins of what the cost to us may not be financial costs as opposed to like what is it doing to our society, right? And taking away certain sectors of jobs. So it just depends on, is it all about cheaper prices to you? Okay. Free trade and outsourcing has kept prices lower over time, but the question is, has it been worth it? Okay. So outsourcing, there can be reasons why being closer to your resources or the factors of production are better. Right. But usually outsourcing is because of cheaper labor cost. In other words, workers get paid less somewhere else. That makes the stuff cheaper. All right, let me show you a chart of this. All right. This is the minimum wages that are paid for garment workers in 2019. Garments meaning like clothing stuff, right? Shoes and clothes, right? So in the U.S., if people were getting paid minimum wage in 2019, that would have been $11.60 per month. All right, that's not a very livable wage in the United States. Period. Okay, but I want you to see compared to where most of your clothes are going to be made, not in the United States or Belgium or the UK or France or Canada, etc. You're not getting clothes made here. You're getting clothes made here and down. Okay, because what you got here, say you got somebody from Vietnam who made your shoes, okay, if they worked, this is monthly minimum wage, okay, well, they're the least amount that they can be paid. Not saying all of them are paid that, but the least that they could be paid legally, $151 a month. If you think about it, that's at 40 hours a week, that's 160 hours a month. That's under $1 an hour in Vietnam to make your shoes, all right? A little over $1 a month in, say, China, okay? Point being that your clothing that's made here is made by people who are making, you know, 10 to 15% of what the least that you get paid in the United States. That's why it's made there. Okay. And so when we're looking at free trade, we're getting stuff cheaper here. True. But that's the cost in terms of you've got somebody who's working on a wage where they can barely buy enough rice and beans to survive off of, right, to make your stuff cheap. Okay. And so the idea of this is that they're not getting paid what's called a living wage, right? Where their standard of living is so miserably low so that we can get more cheap stuff in the United States and other like Western European countries. So there's kind of a moral and ethical issue there that I really think we've got to consider. Okay. What are we going to do about it? I don't know. But I'm telling you, I don't got easy answers, but I at least need to point out to you the reason that a lot of people think this is a problem. Okay. Now, this is a complicated and controversial concept. Okay. But the global economy with loans to poorer countries and stuff, being provided to poorer nations and whatever, has now been called what they will call economic colonialism. Okay, so in the past, right, when you had imperialism, you had countries going and conquering. Yes, I claim this name, the land of, for Spain, right? Now it's not like that. Now it's like, I'm going to go in here and claim that I'm going to do something with the economics of this country to make it better or something, right? Okay. So there is now, okay, so in the past, it was about conquering, ruling over, pulling out the resources from a country, right? Using it for its natural resources and then selling products back to the people, even changing their cultures. Economic colonialism is the idea of more developed countries controlling the lesser developed countries, right, through indirect means, meaning not conquering them and ruling over them with direct power, but from loaning money with strings attached, like you got to do this, getting cheap labor forces to produce stuff for us, right? I'm saying us, United States, Western European countries, right? To produce stuff to build the wealth up in more developed nations. Okay. So poor nations are making stuff for cheaper than we can, right? And then richer nations make the more expensive stuff, right? So it's back to the kind of colonial way, what was called mercantilism, where you're making the more expensive stuff and selling it back to the poorer place. There is an argument for that. I'm not saying you have to agree with it or not. I'm just saying that there are quite a few people who are making that sort of argument, and it's at least one that's got to be kind of considered. Okay. Um, Now, there's a couple of terms that I have been using here, and there's a few sets of economic terms. So let me kind of go on it with a few of them. All right. I mentioned developed and developing nations. That those are kind of the some of the more recent terms. Older terms, if you're reading or heard of older things or talk to your parents about economics, they might have heard of first world and third world. So in the Cold War, there was the US, Canada, Western Europe, right? We consider ourselves the first world. The Soviet communist world, right? The communist world was the second world. The people who were on neither side were called the third world. They were former colonies and poorer, etc. Okay. So first world generally are the ones that are in the blue here. Okay. Now, more recently, we've started calling them developed and developing countries. Okay. So developed countries would be the Western Europe, now into Central Europe, maybe. Um, Australia, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Hong Kong, those areas, right? Singapore. Okay. Now then we call the other countries developing, right? So the orange ones would be the developing countries where they are now industrializing and becoming more developed, but they're not to the same level to where Western Europe and the United States, et cetera, is. Then the least developed countries would be the ones that are in red. They're going to be the poorest ones, okay? And the least industrialized, the least developed. All right. Another set of terms they use for this, and I just want to make sure you're aware of these and you can know what I mean when I say them, is the core would be the core industrialized developed nations, right? The periphery, so core, then peripheries on the outside. So if you look at the economic core and then the economic periphery, the peripheral vision, right, on the outside of your vision, right? The periphery would be the developing nations. Okay, so those are just all some sets of terms used there. All right, now with this, I want to kind of give you another one more kind of set of things to think about here with the kind of the economics of the core periphery developing nations. All right, now the United Kingdom, Great Britain was the first to industrialize early 1800s. And then the U.S., then France and Germany and the rest of Western Europe, then Japan in the late 1800s, early 1900s. They all industrialized, used lots of fossil fuels, and caused lots of, I meant to say environmental damage. That was a typo. Okay. Now, all right, we've damaged the environment a lot. There's a lot of environmental problems out there. With other nations who are trying to industrialize, like people in Europe and the United States and stuff, and we're saying, hey, you guys got to protect the environment, limit your carbon emissions to save the environment. People in the developing world, say India, they're like, that's hypocrisy, man. Like, you guys had us as colonies. You were developing on the basis of our natural resources. You are polluting the environment. Now we get freedom, right? Independence, and we're developing our economy. And you're saying we can't do the same things you're doing, right? That's not fair. And that's the argument they're making. And there's something to that, okay? Is the places that were former colonies of Europeans until after World War II, they're saying, why can't we develop in the same way you did, right? And so we got the balance of between being fair to those nations and, economic, environmental damage and global climate change and things like that we got to balance those things. And that's a hard question also, which is why I gave you an essay question on that this week, is for you to think through some of these things, right? And kind of say, well, what do you think, right? What do you think? So look at that before you go to type that question and know what you think on that, right? You should be able to answer that question with an honest reflection. Okay, so two more kind of free trade type zones here. All right. This first one is way more complex than just free trade. Okay, so the European Union was founded in 1993. The whole idea behind it was there were 28 democratic European nations, right? And basically their governments are going to work together to do certain things. They're primarily based on the idea of free trade and the things that go with that. Part of the idea is that Europe has such a history of wars between each other, Germany and France and, et cetera, right? Over time. We had 2 world wars. They're like, dude, we got to stop with this whole fighting and destroying each other thing, right? And so they figured if they started being more united on a economic sense, then maybe they wouldn't be so focused on destroying each other all the time. And that's actually been worked out okay, right? Now, the whole working on that started before the European Union was founded. So if you're like, what does that have to do with 1993? They started working on this back after, during the Cold War, like way on back in the 50s or 60s kind of thing, right? Became the European Union in 1993. The purpose is for the member nations to work together for advantages that would be out of their reach if they were each working alone. Meaning, all these are smaller countries. Okay, we live in South Carolina, which I think is, if I remember right, is bigger than Austria, for example. Okay, and so when you look at like Georgia's the same size as Germany, right? Like, okay, so if you go to Georgia and you have a business in South Carolina, you can sell stuff in Georgia without paying tariffs or having to exchange currency or something, right? So what they're saying is that if they work together as these smaller nations, they can be a more powerful economic force, putting together more money, more people, more land area, making them all together a stronger force in the world market. And that's true. Okay. That's definitely happened and that's been effective. So the positives of this are the free trade, no barriers to trade. So they don't have tariffs, quotas, or embargoes between nations. So there's no taxes or fees on trade between them. They have a common currency called the euro. So you don't have to exchange when you go from country to country, right? So if you're from France and you go to Germany, you can still use your euros and vice versa. Okay. You can do business in the whole European Union zone. You can trade from one nation to the other very easy. You can travel there very easy. One passport. You can travel, move, work in any other nation than in the EU. And, working together economically has prevented wars and conflicts between the different nations. And that's actually a really big deal, compared to their history. All right, so let's talk about a few negatives here. So it has sacrificed their relationship with their former colonies. So why is this bad? Okay, so here's what I mean. With the European Union, you can't favor anybody else in your trade agreements in the same way that you do within the European Union. So, or at least not more so. So the United Kingdom, for example, have favorable trade previously to their former colonies to try to help improve their economies. So, there's a certain recognition of, hey, you are our colonies, so now we should help you in trade to kind of help you be better off, right? And so under the European Union, they couldn't do that. Okay. Same with France and their colonies and so forth. Okay. And so that actually hurt the economies of the less developed countries in terms of their ability to develop. Two, open borders within the entire European Union zone mean that if you had some terrorist people who snuck into Greece because Greece wasn't as good as protecting their borders, then they could go all the way across, all the way to Germany or France. Okay. And not without being stopped. Okay. Nearly as effectively. So that's why the European Union has had a lot more terrorist attacks in the recent decades than the US has not had another major outside terrorist attack since September 11th. And they've had a lot of them in Europe. Right. Two, they have to allow immigration from other European countries to their country. So take France and Spain, for example. In Western Europe, that means they got lots of members coming, or people moving from Eastern Europe looking for jobs, which then causes a major issue with like taking some of the lower paying jobs in their country away, which then can be problematic in their economy. I've been to Romania before, right over here, and known families that because the language in Romania and Spain is actually kind of similar, or Italy, that a lot of their younger folks go to work in Spain or Italy. All right. And so that's hurting the countries on both ends in a sense, because now your younger, smarter people aren't in Romania, they're in Spain. Right. And then maybe like the grandma from that family had gone to work in cleaning apartments in Spain. Right. So now that took a job away from a Spanish person. Right. And so there's that issue as well. Right. Two, there's a lot more to it than just trade. So environmental regulations, all kinds of regulations. Where the European Union tells them what they have to do, right? And so a lot of people feel like they're losing control over their nation, and some of their power over their own decisions is not there like it was before. So that explains why, for example, there's the issues called Brexit, Britain exit, where the British actually left the European Union in recent years because they felt like it was too controlling, right? It felt like it was telling what to do in ways that they didn't want it to. So there's the positive associated with the freer trade, but then there's negatives also. Okay. All right. So one more organization. It's called OPEC. And this was a little bit different because it's not exactly a free trade organization, but it's a different sort of trade organization that I wanted to mention to you. I did, I think, put a quiz question on there, and it is on your adminum tutorial. So it means the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. So it's led by the Middle Eastern countries such as Saudi Arabia that have a lot of oil. So this has been around for several decades. And more recently, they've been operating as a group called OPEC Plus, which is the original OPEC plus some other countries that maybe weren't traditionally in OPEC, but produce a lot of oil. That includes Russia and some other ones. Okay, so it basically was an economic agreement, not free trade, but still one you need to know. His primary goal was to reach an agreement on the production of crude oil, all right, which has to do with the stuff we put in our cars, right? Gasoline, all right. So their control of the oil supply, the supply demand thing we've talked about a few weeks ago, affected gas prices a lot. Not as much as it used to, but it's still there as an influence. So if there's a war involving OPEC or other problem in their nations, so like we're watching the Gaza and Israel stuff, right? Not so much an issue directly there on oil prices, but if it starts to involve, say, Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Iran, then that will affect oil supply and thus prices will go up. Okay. So any problems within those nations or wars or things like that lowers the supply of oil coming out, which then raises the price of crude oil and therefore gas prices. All right. Again, it's not as big of an effect as it used to be, but it still is an effect that you need to know and the way that they work together to control the supply of oil. Now, just related to that, I want to point out to you who OPEC is and who the OPEC Plus are. So the original OPEC nations are the darker kind of blue-green ones here, all right? And you see Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Kuwait, United Arab Emirates, right? Those groups right there. Algeria, Libya, Nigeria, Venezuela, all right, and a few others. And then OPEC Plus includes some others like Mexico has a good bit of oil, Kazakhstan, Russia, especially. Okay. And so you can kind of see OPEC as of 2022, 28.7 million barrels of oil being produced today. OPEC Plus, another 16 and a half. And so that's a lot of the oil supply of the world. Interestingly enough, the United States is not in either level of the organization, although we produce more oil per day than any one country. All right. We were actually the top oil producer. The reason we're not in the OPEC group to discuss is that the OPEC groups was actually there in large part to counteract kind of the influence of the U.S. over the world economy and being able to kind of push back on our influence a bit. So that's why we're not involved at all. All right. And you will probably notice that there are several countries within these groups that we don't particularly get along with. We're kind of friendly with Saudi Arabia, more so than we probably should be because they have so much to do with oil. Right. We don't get along with Russia at all, obviously. Iran, not at all. Venezuela, no. All right. And so it's a complicated relationship, and they do have a good bit of influence on the world economy based on the oil thing. All right. So the conclusion I wanted to get to today is that there are other international trade organizations beyond the ones I just gave you there, but these three I think are ones that I wanted you to know, be able to understand what they do, their positives, their negatives, and kind of give us a good start in understanding the issues of trade between nations if you kind of understand what we talked about the last three classes. All right, so in closing, what we're looking at for the week is you have one admin module. Make sure you did it well. It's called Regulation of Trade. You need to make sure that you have looked at the two live lessons, right? Two ed puzzle videos, and then a quiz on Friday, which involves a multiple choice part on progress learning and a essay part, which I've been really clear on what that essay is. So you should have thought through what you want to type in even before you go to type it in, right? So it's not like a mysterious one. You just got to think through what you're going to type, make sure it's your work and not Google's work and not AI's work. Okay. All right. So that is that. And I will see you next time. Let me know if you got any questions or need any help.